Thanks for having me, and hello to all. So I was asked by the organizers to try and give a bit of local flavor to the criticism of democracy, and so this is something which kind of stuck out for me. It has been a very tricky and difficult issue and difficult problem to get a hang on in Estonia. And yes, and just as the chair introduced, when preparing for this talk, then I suddenly remembered this one very famous classic essay by Freud called Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, where he makes this point. It was written in 1929 and published in 1931, I believe, in early 30s, where he makes the point that he wonders how it has come to pass that so many people have taken up this strange attitude of hostility to civilization, or culture as it would be in German. And then went on to diagnose the modern man with a metaphorical neurosis, as he's unable to reconcile his yearning for freedom, which comes from instincts, with a repressive demand for conformity imposed on him by demands of culture. And it would seem to me that today the very same question could be asked about democracy that Freud posed on culture. At least it certainly could be asked in case of Estonia. Just as the chair mentioned, Estonia has been performing remarkably well for over the last several years in terms of different indices, rankings and surveys concerning freedom and democracy. And it's not only that it has performed well in its own terms, in the terms of where we're coming from, and I'll return to that in a moment. Estonia clearly punches well above its weight, even when compared to most of the Western so-called established democracies. So just to give some perspective or some points to prove this, is that one of the best known, these minimalist definition indices, Freedom House Index, awards Estonia full points in all three different categories of freedom. Then perhaps the most famous composite index, Polity 4, ranks, or it has a scale of maximum 10 points, and Estonia scores 9 in this. There are only some minor grievances which are mostly related to the treatment of the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia, but you know, if that is taken out of the equation, then Estonia is you know, almost full 10-point scoring democracy in Western Europe. Then there are different kinds of composite indexes that include also so-called softer issues, such as the Integral Development Index, which aggregates the Human Development Index, the Freedom House rankings, gender equality, and Gini distribution indexes. And this is where Estonia comes 25th in the world. This is placing it between Japan and UK, and then well ahead, about 10 points or 10 places higher than United States. Also, the recently published Social Progress Index ranks Estonia 19th in the world. So in that regard, it would seem that everything is perfect, everything is great and fine. At the same time, the state of democracy and freedom have come to face pretty harsh criticism in Estonia over the last few years. The approval ratings of government, parliament, and political parties have been plummeting. Just as the first speaker mentioned, they still remain high when compared to what is considered normal in the Western world. Although, again, it is actually an interesting question in and of itself, that how has that come to pass that an approval rating of less than 20% is considered normal in the democratic world. But this is another topic for another day, so it would be a long talk. So yeah, in comparative perspective, Estonia's approval ratings for its political institutions still remain relatively high, but they have been coming down very fast, and it has of course caused some alarm and some concern. The issue I want to home in on, or use as a kind of an example, so that we wouldn't be just talking about the abstract criticism, is of course related to the occasion of 2 years ago when the one particular political scandal rocked the Estonian political establishment, political world, which had something to do with the guy who I suppose was talking in the last panel here. Which I wasn't here, but I saw him in the lunch. So yeah, it was related to the party finances, and so Silver Meikar was the person who blew the whistle, and so this is how it got started. But due to a number of particular instances and some rather bad decisions by certain people in power, this thing sort of spinned out of control and ended with street rallies and in 3 major Estonian cities, which is something that has been unseen in Estonia for almost a generation, and culminated then also in a public manifesto, which was published at the same time, coinciding with the street rallies and demonstrations, which I was one of the original signatories. Thought I'd come out with this so that it would be clear that I'm not a impartial observer in this matter, and the. This manifesto received about 18,000 signatures in a matter of a few days. So this figure might not be that impressive in terms of people coming from China, but just to put it in perspective, it's about 1.5% of the Estonia's population. So in that regard, this is something to take notice of, and it was clearly taken notice of. This manifesto began with the words, if I remember it correctly, that the Estonian democracy is falling apart before our very eyes. So this discrepancy, this curious discrepancy between the picture that we would get from following the indices and the international comparative reports, and with what has been going on in Estonia, has been described as Estonia being sort of unhappy overachiever in democracy. A society that systematically misjudges and therefore fails to appreciate its own success and sets itself unrealistic targets and unreasonable targets. And this apparent contradiction has been pointed out by many local politicians in various ways at the different levels of politeness, and with an obvious implication that Estonian public must be in a dire need of something akin to a therapy, so that they could come to terms with the objective reality. There have been several different and many different kinds of explanations offered to this the state of affairs, and as could be expected, people on the different side of the divide, meaning then the mostly politicians and the critics of the situation, tend to have widely differing opinions of the matter, why this should be. What I would like to call the official line, or it's certainly been favored by those in power, insists that Estonia indeed has a robust and generally well-working democracy, as demonstrated by these different rankings, and that the root problem must be in the fact that the economic crisis and austerity measures have been exerting a toll on the general population, whose frustration has found out the kind of an outlet in apparently irrational and unreasonable resentment against politicians who are simply doing their hard and thankless work. People, as the argument goes, simply mistake the unfortunate but inevitable hardships due to the global economic crisis for a failure of local democratic institutions. It is thus fundamentally a problem of false consciousness. As a corollary, it's often suggested that the Estonian public has unrealistic expectations towards democracy, supposedly arising from insufficient experience with the way how democratic institutions work in so-called real life. Politicians, particularly those in the coalition, like to stress that Estonia is far and beyond the most successful state emerged from the train wreck of the former Soviet Union. And this is, I'm not going to argue with this, so this is true, although it remains somewhat unclear to me why that would be a relevant comparison, but I'll just leave it at that, so maybe we can come back to that later. A lot could be, of course, said about the purported universality of the criteria that is used for compiling these indices that I was referring to before. And indeed, it's for ranking the different countries. And indeed, it's actually an interesting question again in itself, that why would the state or country be some kind of normal or privileged container or unit of democracy? Why couldn't it be, for instance, the state? Where I would imagine that in China, for instance, there must be a very big difference between the democratic entrenchment or democratic practices when you compare places like Shanghai with the countryside or with rural China. So when we rank countries, then we kind of assume that there's a homogeneous state of democracy throughout the country. And again, this has to do with some things that I'm coming to in a moment. It is enough for our purposes here just to note that the scores like those are highly dependent on what exactly is being measured. So despite democracy having been the subject of learned debate for the last 25 centuries, for better or worse, as Robert Dahl has observed, no definite understanding or definition of democracy has emerged, and this means that we also really do not have, this discrete set of points based on which to judge whether something is democratic or not. It is still open to a discussion, and this is perhaps one of the main reasons why these indices seem to take this formalistic approach, to take a certain kind of almost like, assume that there's a certain kind of necessary conditions for democracy, and if those are present, then democracy must emerge. So it's something that just comes out of there being these conditions present. I am personally deeply skeptical towards this thing, but let's again leave it at that and just keep it in mind when we come back to the issue in a little later. Mostly these indices tend to measure indicators that are related to electoral, so in terms of contestation and competition, and liberal in terms of basic liberties, political rights, transparency, and so forth, aspects of democracy. And those are generally considered to be those core dimensions that I mentioned before, democracy's necessary conditions. On the other hand, opinions differ if they are sufficient. So if it's true that once they are there, democracy will inevitably emerge, or if they are different or sufficient in a different sense, if those dimensions exhaust what one might reasonably expect from democracy. What I want to argue is that in very basic terms, this combination of electoral and liberal dimensions constitutes parliamentary democracy as kind of political market, where parties compete for votes and power, while people are free to choose among different sets of policies on offer. According to this view, the central question of democratic politics is how to transform often contradictory and conflicting private interests into homogeneous and streamlined public policy. It implies clear distinction between these two things, between private and public, and it seems to assume that these two things are, mutually exclusive and jointly exhausted. I would like to point out that this disregards, or rather lumps together with private, one important dimension that is in fact neither private nor public. In Estonia, there's actually a very good example at hand from a recent past, and this is something that all the Estonians in the hall know. It's become kind of an overused example. It's the Let's Do It campaign from 2008. Where about 50,000 people gathered in a single day, participated in a one-day cleanup of the forests and countryside in Estonia, whereby about 10,000 tons of garbage and waste was gathered and removed. And the problem of waste and garbage, why I bring up this example, is that it is normally seen as either as private, as it would be if it was in my house, or as a public, if it was on the streets. However, what this campaign did, it made it common, which is between the private and public. So it's, and I would argue that it's not even between, it's a different dimension of political space of possibility. The event was universally celebrated as a great success of the civil society, as a model to be followed and expanded, and indeed it has. So to the date, there have been officially 198 similar cleanups organized now in 100 different countries. However, it was not seen as overtly political. As you know, it could be seen from the side of the public power that it took place in the private realm. So it was a private association of people and trying to do something together. Now jumping back, or jumping forward in time rather, to the time when people took it to the streets in 2012, as a way to diffuse these tensions, President of the Republic called forth independence, called forth a deliberative body, which was called Rahvakogu in Estonia, or People's Council. It was a structure principally modeled after James Fishkin's and Robert Luskin's deliberative polling mechanism. So this was comprised by citizens, assembled by random selection, modeled as closely as possible after the profile of the nation as whole. So in that sense, I would argue that it's more representative body than the parliament, which is traditionally seen as a representative tool of representative democracy. The input for the People's Council was solicited by a portal where all the citizens could enter their proposals, which were then discussed and aggregated by panels of experts. Selected proposals were then accompanied by carefully balanced expert opinions and assessments of impact, and then submitted to the Council for the day of deliberation. In terms of law, this kind of common deliberation was, of course, again, purely private matter. So it's, but there was an interesting thing. Because it took place under the auspices of the office of the president, then Estonian parliamentary system works this way, that the parliament is, of course, a legislative body, but the laws can be proposed either by the members of the parliament, by the government, or by the president. And so the president offered to be the sort of the stand-in, so to take whatever proposals come out of the deliberation and take them to the parliament to be, you know, as law proposals. So there were 15 proposals that came out. And it must be said that in the retrospective, Rahvakogu is generally seen as a kind of a disappointment. So people's opinions differ on this, how mild or serious disappointment it is. And after 2 years, most of the proposals are in a process of dying a death of 1,000 cuts somewhere in the chambers of the parliament. But I would still like to argue that I think I'll probably need 1 or 2 more minutes, but I'll try and conclude shortly. So the importance of Rahvakogu lies in something else. In my mind, it lies precisely in this attempt of trying to posit this dimension of a common, what I said before, as an autonomous dimension of politics, not something that is kind of like pre-political, something that happens before the politics proper starts and takes place. And of course, this road is very much beset by problems. There are very serious vested interests from the powers that be, from the parliament, from the political parties, and there are serious issues to be taken into the account. But what I would like to point out here is that as a kind of a way of analogy, the way we see French Revolution nowadays is that we tend to see it as a momentous event that changed the world, that changed the Western politics. However, as Michael Schonecher from Princeton has pointed out, it would be much more pertinent to understand the French Revolution as a long period of social change taking place throughout, better part of the 18th century in France, which eventually had a political consequence. And so I'd like to suggest that this is precisely how the political innovation takes place, not through the fundamental or big cataclysmic events and revolutions, rather than by small steps that change our perception of what is possible and what is not, what can be considered politic and what cannot. Just to jump over some stuff, but just to conclude shortly, I think that Estonia has a very peculiar and very interesting position here, that we could aspire to be a country that is known not only for its fondness for technological innovation, but also for political innovation. This has sadly been something that Estonia has been just, been trying to copy the others as closely and neatly as possible. But I think that this should not be seen only as a threat to the political system, as it's often seen by local politicians, but as an opportunity to be a leader in something that could have a much wider relevance and importance. So, thank you.
So, thank you very much. As we know, as we heard, then Estonians are very self-critical, and which can actually be a good thing, because if you're not happy, you can strive for better, right? So, so we do have a chance to become maybe a test site, not only for technologies but also to kind of political innovations. But at the same time, I would say that there is some rational point of having this kind of a democracy as we have it now. So, because to be involved with political decisions every day is quite consuming for ordinary people. So it could be rational just to participate once and then get a result you actually want by the people who are elected at the end. And maybe this discontent in Estonia is connected with the fact that actually in last years in Estonia the economic development has sort of slowed down, even after the crisis, and even compared with our direct neighbors. So there could be also linkage with economic development, in the sense that if Estonia would start developing faster, people would become busier again, and not to complain so much about the state of democracy in Estonia.
Well, this is of course a question that would deserve a very long answer. I'll just try to make it short. So, in one way, the way you pose that question comes clearly from the modernization theory, saying that this is where the people's self-expression values people tend to value self-expression higher when their economic economic performance of the country is higher. But then again, that would contradict what you said precisely in the end. So when why should people get less interested in politics if the economy starts growing again? So I think there's a kind of an implicit problem in this. The other thing, what I would like to remark upon just briefly, is that the thing that you mentioned at the beginning of your question, saying that people really don't want to get involved in politics normally. If everything's working fine, then they are glad to leave things to politicians, and they don't want to get involved in all the different and messy and technical aspects. But the point with what I've been making in a number of different occasions previously about the difference between the parliamentary politics and participatory politics is that in the case of the latter, you don't need to get involved in all the different things. So this is a very peculiar thing about parliamentary politics. This is something that happened in Estonia a few years ago when Greens first got to the parliament. And this has happened in different places in Europe as well, the same way. For instance, consider when Greens got to the parliament in Estonia, then suddenly they had to come up with green defense policy. They didn't have that at first. So their main concern was their environment. Their main concern was perhaps also kind of equality and things like this. But suddenly, if you are a player on that field, if you are a player in the parliamentary politics, then you are required to have an opinion on all the different political aspects, because this is the way how the parliament works. And therefore, you need to have the green defense policy. It doesn't make all that much sense to me, but this is something where I would argue that in case of the participatory politics, you don't need to participate in everything. You can participate in parts that relate to you, that relate to your interests, and leave the parts that don't relate to your interest to others. And maybe sometimes also actually to the parliament. So.
Okay, thank you very much.